Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 134th episode. We had Vasuki Shastry on Kopi Time back in the spring of 2021 on episode 51. At that time, we talked about the challenges for developing Asia, drawing from his book, Has Asia Lost It? Dynamic Past, Turbulent Future? But today's podcast is focused on India. Vasuki and a number of other economists and analysts have lately been thinking hard about India's potential, which can arguably only be realized through large-scale manufacturing and manufacturing-led value addition and employment creation. I'm looking forward to this conversation because this issue is also close to my heart, and some of the ideas that Vasuki has put out in some of the articles that he's published recently, they have resonated with me tremendously. Vasuki Shastry is a senior advisor at Gatehouse Advisory Partners, a geostrategic consulting firm. He was formerly with the IMF, Standard Chartered Bank, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore. He serves on the advisory council of Chatham House and the Institute of Human Rights and Business. He's the author of 3 books. I've already mentioned one of them, Has Asia Lost It? But also in 2018, he had published Resurgent Indonesia, From Crisis to Confidence. Vasuki, that can be another podcast another day. And also his book from last year, The Notorious ESG. Vasuki Shastry, welcome back to Kopi Time.
I'm delighted to be here, Taimur. It's been a long time, but absolutely delighted that you've kept the podcast going, and I listen to many of them. They're really, really interesting, and living far away from Asia, it's a fascinating window for me on developments on the ground.
Thanks for your kind words, Vasuki. It's people like you who make it happen. So I'm grateful that you're back on the podcast. Vasuki, let's get right to the heart of the matter. We are approaching the 10th anniversary of Make in India. Help us take stock. What is Make in India and how has it evolved?
Yeah, I think there's a historic backdrop as to why Prime Minister Modi, within 3 months of assuming office in 2014, decided essentially to reconfigure the Indian economy, which still is and still was at that time heavily dependent on consumption and services. There was a deeply held belief in the policy community in India, and this dates back many decades, that we probably wouldn't be having this conversation if India's state-owned enterprises had delivered value, had captured a greater share of GDP over a period of time. They were placed at the commanding heights of the economy for many decades. They faltered, many of them failed. So there was a sense of a need for renewal, even in the early 1990s, when India embarked on its reform journey. But I think it all came into place in a way in 2014. There was a sense that, Indian growth had been, particularly in the 1990s, 8% GDP on average. There was a sense that this growth journey would end at some stage. And you certainly needed to revive manufacturing, incentivize manufacturing. So in a very simple way, there were 2 concepts, 2 defining beliefs when Make in India was launched in September 2014. First is, of course, drive manufacturing, increase its share of GDP. It's in the low teens. It's increased marginally over the past decade. We can talk about why and when of this concept. And the second thing really is India's, on one hand, demographic sweet spot, 1 billion people under the age of 30. But at the same time, you need to create those quality jobs for the estimated 8 to 10 million young people coming into the job market every year. And, at the outset, that has been a failure. And India's underemployment problem really poses social and political risks. And the fact that it has not happened is always a puzzle for me. So bringing it all together and to make in India really, really attractive, the government really had to junk 5 to 6 decades of philosophy that you don't incentivize foreign investors. But any incentives that are given at the margin, give it to the domestic private sector, but absolutely hoard all of those incentives for the state. And so, really unshackling that thinking and putting at the center that we're going to provide production-linked incentives for foreign investors to come and make in India. And to come and make in India in 25 sectors, many of these are core, what the government has identified as core industrial sectors, advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, uh, uh, telecommunications, automobiles. So there was a great deal of ambition in this Make in India project, great deal of energy and enthusiasm on the part of the government to promote this. They promoted this ceaselessly across global platforms. You saw Prime Minister Modi acting as salesperson in chief at Davos, for example, rubbing shoulders with the Fortune 100 CEOs. So, and I think it's useful as we take a deep dive to differentiate between the enthusiasm and the performance of Make in India in the first term of Mr. Modi. And I think there's a differentiated set of performance in the second term. And the second term, I think, has been more problematic in terms of regulatory outcomes, in terms of the sense that many in India have, particularly in the private sector, that this is not a level playing field. But that sense was not there in the first 2 or 3 years. And, you've got to remember this happened pre-China-US Cold War or trade tensions, whatever you might. So this happened at the time. So this predated China's own Make in China 2025, which was really focused on advanced manufacturing and really sent a scare in Europe and the US that China was catching up fast. So India was in that sweet spot. And, the headline that I'd like to give before we discuss this in detail is it's been a qualified failure. It's been a qualified failure for a variety of reasons. There have been a number of high-profile foreign investors who've taken the dive, Micron, certainly all the contract manufacturers of Apple. So the iPhone, 14 or 15 billion worth are shipped out of India these days. This is a tiny, tiny proportion of what is produced still in China. So bringing all of this together, I think we've got to focus a little bit on geopolitics, the fact that a lot of foreign investors are moving away from China. So there's a fundamental question. If Make in India has faltered, has been a qualified failure, can this government in its third term pick up the pieces and really benefit from this wave of investment coming out of China in regional supply chains? Much of it is going to Vietnam. But can India capture this? I think that's the big philosophical question for the next 3 years. Let me pause here.
No, that's a great way to set up this whole conversation. Vasuki, I want to work with you in terms of going through some data on a bunch of parameters to establish that assertion, which will be headline grabbing, no question about the unqualified failure of Make in India. But before I do that, I just want to go back to 2014 for a second. Vasuki, at that time, I remember Raghuram Rajan, who was the governor of RBI at that time, and he himself questioned the philosophical underpinning of Make in India. And I think he said something like, we should focus on Make for India, which I interpreted that if we're going to give some performance-linked investments incentive, we should do it for import substitution, not necessarily for export orientation, because that's a hyper-competitive landscape. Do you think that's my right read of what Raghu was coming from? And what was your take at that time, this import substitution versus export orientation around Make in India?
Right. So if you look at the value chain proposition that India had, and unfortunately, I think if you go low down, if you're looking at low value addition, labor intensive industries like textiles and garments, where India has essentially been outmaneuvered by Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. Indian wages are high compared to these three countries. And there's complexity really even in producing textiles and garments. And that's the reason why India has consistently lost market share. Right. So if you take the proposition that you can make in India for India, then because of the labor intensity, and because of the fact that you've got millions of people knocking at literally looking for a job every single year. So how can you match those low technical skills with low wage industries like textiles? And India's kind of missed the bus in that. I don't know if the current problems in Bangladesh presents a window of opportunity for India to reassert itself in textiles and garments. So then if you go at high value addition, the problem is you can't make in India for India. iPhones are an example where it's part of a complex regional supply chain. Components have to flow through from Singapore, from Malaysia, and other parts of East Asia into the final assembly point, be it China or India, as it happens to be the case. But India has got this very, very ambivalent approach towards imports, and has always had this strong sense that of self-reliance, which Prime Minister Modi kind of renewed in his first term. And that's a problem. I mean, it's a problem if you're going to say that you're going to make in India for India, then you kind of have to be like the Chinese manufacturing majors who are world-beating, who are producing in China for China, the BYDs and the CATLs of the world, and then have assumed global market share. That seems to be a very, very difficult hurdle, I think, for India. There are a couple of industries in India which are world-beating, right? So you bring it all together, and then you want to increase value addition, you want to absolutely increase manufacturing employment, and you want to increase GDP share. And the only way you can do it in today's globalized world, and I know there's a lot of debate on whether deglobalization is a reality or not, but in that reality, you've got to do it for India to be part of a regional supply chain, which traditionally and historically it has stayed away from. And I think when we review performance of Make in India, I think that's one of the biggest hurdles. I think it's a mindset challenge, both on part of the policymakers and on part of the private sector. And, to your point on Raghu Rajan, Raghu has come out more recently arguing that the absolute amount given out, for example, for the Micron facility in India, where the subsidy runs in excess of 1.8, 1.9 billion on part of the government, federal and state, that this exceeds in many ways the budget for higher education, right? So is India making a calculated choice of putting all of its eggs in the Micron basket or the Apple basket, and what kind of long-term value addition is there going to be? And I think that's the right question to ask of a policymaker. But if you ask, let's be fair with the government, and I think the government's proposition has always been they want to make this work. They don't believe there's a single approach of PLIs for everybody in order to make in India successful. There's also a sense that you've got to improve the business environment and the regulatory environment for everyone else to do well. And I think that is where the bottleneck is at the moment.
Right. Okay, let's do performance evaluation of Make in India. FDI, how has it been over the decades since the program began?
Right, so you've got two sets of statistics, Taimur, right? Let's be fair. The Indian government, the Make in India Secretariat, has made the assertion that in the last 10 years, you kind of have attracted between 600 to 900 billion in foreign direct investment. And I've actually gone and checked through the numbers. It seems to be a consolidated gross number that they're quoting, because there's lots of, and I still have an open question mark of whether that includes portfolio flows. Right, so there's a lot of noise in that data, right? So then you look at an outside credible source like UNCTAD, which is over a long period of time has put out FDI data. And the UNCTAD data, for example, between 2019 and 2024 suggests 200 plus billion has come in. Greenfield investment commitments, which are future commitments for which foreign investment flows have not yet come in, they're again of the order of 200 billion or so. But so it's a mixed picture. And I think when we say Make in India has been a qualified failure, there was the sense that there would be this absolute mad rush on the part of multinational corporations looking to reshore, looking to relocate manufacturing in India, mainly because of the India growth story. You had the ability to cater to the domestic market. India's geography is very favorable, so it could also be used as an export destination. But the FDI data, right? So if you try and link the high numbers quoted by the Make in India Secretariat, and then you go down and see, has this actually moved the needle on manufacturing share of GDP? So even if you assume the Indian government statistics suggest 28% is the number of manufacturing share of GDP, private sector estimates are significantly low. They're in the high teens at the moment, right? So you've got to have a great deal of faith in the official data to say it's been a unqualified success. But if you look at the noise in the data, it would suggest that there's been a much more modest success in Make in India, and there are lots of big question marks at the moment on level playing field, regulatory enforcement, and this is not just a question, I think, for foreign investors as concerns. It is increasingly a question for India's large business houses, who, again, if you look at the data coming out of sources like CMIE, have essentially over the last 10 years pocketed all the profits, after-tax profits that they have generated. They're also benefiting from a lower corporate tax rate over the last 7 years. But at the same time, they seem to be reluctant. And, the statistic that one looks at is gross capital formation, which again does not match with this over-enthusiasm in the Make in India story, as suggested by the government.
Right. I think data is certainly an issue. We've had also issues with the GDP data. So when we talk about manufacturing share of GDP, both the numerator and the denominator, there are question marks around that. Unfortunately, Vasuki, notwithstanding data issue, what's your sense of job creation around Make in India over the last decade?
Right. So you've got to probably divide this up into three buckets. Right. So you've got elite foreign investors, right? So you've got Apple, you now have Micron, but Micron's facility is still under construction. One can say that the three Apple contract manufacturers probably have the ability to create between 50,000 to 100,000 jobs. If the Apple production facility has been able to scale up, if increasingly you're finding that in Shenzhen and other parts of southern China, there's a relocation actually taking place in the Apple iPhone production, away from China into Vietnam, into India, right? So that's that story. So that number of 50,000 to 100,000 clearly is unimpressive, right? So if you're looking at the ambition at the start of Make in India was we're going to create 100 million jobs between 2014 and 2022. And one can safely say that number has not been matched, right? So if you look at, again, there's a problem with data. If you put together manufacturing employment in the last decade, and this extends to beyond Make in India, you come up with a number probably 55, 60 million. Then you've got the issue of how many young people are entering the job market every year. And that really is a surge. I mean, it's like a tsunami, mainly because of India's rich demographics. It's a rich tsunami, which, in theory should help India grow on a sustained basis for the next 2 to 3 decades at least. But then there's a big question mark surrounding quality of education, right? So if you're able to match these young educated, and they could be the graduate engineers, they could be coming out of the vocational technical training institute, uh, right? So there's no supply problem in theory. But on the demand side, what the employers are saying is this: there's a skills deficit. There's a skills deficit of a magnitude which the private sector alone cannot resolve. Therefore, there needs to be some kind of public-private intervention. You've got to figure out whether you can, take people in as apprentices and train them. And this is a long-term journey. I mean, it's never going to happen overnight. That is why you still see these eye-popping headlines in Indian media about this vast reservoir of young people, probably straight out of college, right? So in the 19 to 30 age group, I mean, this is the group that, any aging society like Japan and Korea will really, really be desperate to have at this point of their own growth story. But India's ability, and India is, of course, not alone, I think, in this, but in terms of volume, certainly a big problem. If you look at Indonesia, and certainly look at sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, they're likely to face similar challenges down the line. So, and again, the contradiction here is, I mean, the economy is chugging along, right? It's chugging along at 6 to 7%, notwithstanding challenges with the GDP numbers. But one can kind of feel, at least in the urban centers, one can kind of feel there's a growth momentum underway. But at the same time, one can see that there are a number of people who are unemployed, right? So manufacturing, I would argue, would be the solution at all levels, starting with textiles, garments, low value addition. And there hasn't been, unfortunately, a cohesive plan, right? So Make in India is almost functioning like an elite island for really top-notch foreign investors and Indian investors who are in that same league. And then you've got this vast category below of mid-sized business who really feel that, they face all the depredations of, tough labor legislation. You've got the tax person knocking at the door of these mid-sized businesses. So there's regulatory harassment. So that explains, I think, the gap, with the fact that they have not been able to meet this 100 million number, and they're well short of it. And they're likely to be well short of this if Make in India is kind of not reconfigured and make it easier. I would say one easy fix was to make it easy for domestic business to invest once again.
Vasuki, I want to stay on the job creation issue a little longer. What about regional heterogeneity in Indonesia? In India, I mean, are the northern part of India states creating more jobs than the southern part of India? Do we see more youth unemployment in UP versus we see in Karnataka? Give us a little sense of, because India is a big country, there are a lot of inter-regional heterogeneity there.
Yeah, so the mobility story is an interesting one. Right, if you go to the southern states, and southern states almost, the typology is almost like a East European country, a middle-income East European country with an aging population and with lots of imported labor, right? And these tend to come from the north and the east. And for those, and for this vast army of construction labor, of labor working in low-value manufacturing, for them, it's their upward mobility ticket of moving to richer parts of India. And of course, India, unlike China, does not place any restrictions on inward mobility, right? So you find that there's already some signs of domestic pressure, local pressure. People feel that all of these outsiders have come over and taken all of these, and they don't necessarily spend, India's linguistic complexity makes it all the more difficult to build this cohesiveness, right? But one can argue that if you're building in Tamil Nadu an automobile component manufacturing facility, you tend to hire either from the West or from the South. That's where most of the qualified graduate engineers and technicians and even welders and plumbers happen to be. But if you're looking to clear land and build a massive residential or commercial complex, then you import labor from Uttar Pradesh or Bihar. And this labor, by the way, has mobility opportunities not just within India. They can go to Saudi Arabia, they can go to the Middle East, and that's been a traditional route for many of them. And many of them actually come back with better skills, particularly in construction. And I would argue that quality of Indian construction, office buildings, has probably improved dramatically in the last 2 decades because many of the returned have come back with better skills. But the problem, once again, is if you're an Apple and you're trying to recruit 10,000. I mean, the Foxconn facilities in China, for example, employ 500,000 people, right? So try to imagine replicating 500,000 in a Foxconn Apple network in southern India or western India. And that would be a challenge, I think, because there is a real skills deficit. There's fungibility where, if you're a qualified engineer, you don't necessarily have to stay in India. The qualified professional, as you know, India is an exporter of high value talent. So I think there will be that absolute hurdle when it comes to Apple ever making a decision. Okay, we're now ready to move. Right. So India will always, I think, be in that suboptimal space of being able to create employment of technical employment of the kind that a multinational firm like Apple will need.
Right. Just one final question on the employment side. Vasuki, whenever we talk about youth unemployment in India, the picture that is typically drawn for us is this young, likely Northern Indian male who can get a job, and there are social implications for that. I feel that, the young women are sort of, devoid in that discussion. And India has been surprisingly underperforming in terms of female participation in the labor force. You had mentioned earlier the garments industry in Bangladesh. There we have seen in the last 2-3 decades a huge change in terms of the fact that it's largely women who work on those factories. So I'm sure even without looking at the data, we can say that unemployment among women, to those who are actually looking for it, is even a more challenging phenomenon in India than it is for male. And within the Make in India construct, was there ever any sort of, policy toward helping increasing the ratio of women's labor participation?
Not within Make in India, right? So Make in India is very high level that they're going to introduce new processes, new infrastructure, and new investment into manufacturing. So it is very, very high purpose. But certainly, the government has tried over the last 10 years. It has recognized that they need to increase female labor force participation, which for a country like India, it's appallingly low, right? And there've been all kinds of right. So you've got two kinds of challenges in doing that. I don't think the education challenge is one of them. Surprisingly, I think you even if you go down to a technical institute in any part of India, the number of women now studying engineering or even undertaking technical training, that number is high. But you've got these social barriers which really prevent this translation of those skills from the classroom into the manufacturing facility. I think Indian employers have, again, one has to differentiate, but certainly in manufacturing, have not done a very good job. And I've seen that myself in other work that I do. They've not done a very good job in creating that welcoming environment and culture where men and women can work in the same manufacturing place. I think it's probably improved in offices, in white-collar jobs, and that's probably always been the case. But in manufacturing, you've got simple things like distance, right? So how do you overcome distance in terms of, providing transport for female workers and doing so in a safe and secure manner? how do you make sure that they have the ability to work multiple shifts? I think working night shifts is still a stigma. And these are really structural barriers on a micro level that no federal government in Delhi can sit. I mean, federal government in Delhi can create the enabling environment, but ultimately it comes down to local government and the states. And the states which are doing a better job compared with the national average, again, tend to be in the South and the West. But again, it's a very, very mixed picture. And 10 years, I think, is a long time to take stock. And, one can argue that, Make in India probably premature for me to say only 10 years. Why am I saying qualified failure? But I think in terms of female labor force participation, I mean, this predates the Modi government.
Yes.
And no government has been able to fix this.
That's
and they can be a powerful growth driver. And the fact that, India probably can learn from the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who, under international pressure and domestic pressure and the fact that Japan is aging so rapidly, at least made a concerted policy push in this area. And India probably needs something similar to that, in parallel with anything that they do with Make in India in the future.
Correct. So 10 years is a long time. So I think we should be able to make some evaluation. I think that's fair. And the one that I want to talk about now is tech transfer. We have seen, even before Make in India, global consumer goods companies from Unilever to Starbucks to Domino's, they've come to India over the decades. Did we see some of their supply chain management spill over into domestic Indian F&B supply chain? And then over the last decade, the push toward bringing global manufacturers like Foxconn and others in, are we seeing some positive spillover out of that with respect to tech transfer or, skilled labor or skilled entrepreneurs getting experience in those companies and building something on their own in India?
Right. So you've got to look at this. I mean, you can't divorce, I think, when we discuss this from the technology sector. And the fact that, India has got world-beating public goods like the India Stack, the fact that you've got many of America's big tech majors who've got significant, research facilities in India, including the likes of IBM. And I think the IBM facility in India is still one of the largest single location for employment, right? So you've got this, again, and you've got these islands of excellence. And India, more recently in the last 2 decades, has seen, the Starbucks and the Tim Hortons setting up franchise operations all over the country. You've got the entry of many hotel chains, consumer goods manufacturers. There's definitely, a skills transfer taking place. But I guess the question is, and again, not to speak poorly of fast food franchise chains.
I know where you're going.
The skills transfer that takes place, it's probably essential, I think, in a country like India, where you've got so many people looking for jobs in the 20 to 30 age group, that, I used to, 2 decades ago, really be amused at the fact that you've got these master's degrees proliferating in India in events management. And, every second university had an events management undergrad and a graduate degree. And I was always thinking, what possible value does this create? And I was probably wrong, because India now does have a vibrant events management space. They're learning a lot in putting up events from concert promoters from other parts of the world. So you've got these pockets where there is skills transfer taking place. People are upgrading their skills. And for those who want to access online education tools, that is available in India today, right? But you've got to be proficient. You've got to be at a certain educational level in order to tap into those online courses and upgrade your own skills, because ultimately, learning is also an individual journey, not just the responsibility of the state. But when you come to actual manufacturing and advanced technologies, right? So there's there's talk of semiconductors, and I think Prime Minister Modi was in Singapore last week. This collaboration on semiconductor testing. India is probably way, way behind that, and that explains this controversy over what Micron is attempting to do in Gujarat, where the technology on offer is seen as being slightly behind the curve. So there's a lot of hope and expectation on a single company like Apple, because I think people have seen the Apple journey in China and the absolutely transformative power that it had in really upgrading skills. Really, I don't think Apple could have succeeded without the presence of Foxconn and the tremendous investment it put in human skills development. And so you need at scale, and Vietnam, although a much smaller country, is doing that because it's had the benefit of Korean investment in the last 2 decades. So India, in many ways, is starting off behind the curve, and that skills transfer has to happen with these manufacturing companies being able to say that they're going to take people on board and actually train them on the shop floor.
Right. Vasuki, okay, let's put aside the low end of the skill spectrum and the top end. Let's focus on the middle end. Like, are we going to see Indian entrepreneurs or even the large conglomerates creating made in India TV brands or drones? So not like, the 3 nanometer chip, super fancy smartphone, but, what we call, I guess, a lagging edge technology in which there are, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of potential investment and job creation and so on. But are we still seeing basically, Chinese manufacturers assembling cell phones in India, or even like for a TV, it's really made in China TV that is coming into India? We don't have that much of a homegrown technology stack to replicate that yet.
Right. So, there's a lot of talk here in Washington, D.C. on how the U.S., particularly since the early 1990s, when both China entered the WTO in 2000, and predating that, of course, was NAFTA, that you had this exodus of manufacturing away from the US, and which led to this over-dependence on China for almost everything from toys to light bulbs and everything else. Similar thing has happened, I think, in India. And India is at this very interesting policy juncture now, where I think the national security community is deeply concerned of Indian business over-reliance on China, particularly in key sectors like pharmaceuticals, and you mentioned mobile phones, and there are any number of other industries. And I think the China-India trade numbers really reflect the fact that India is exporting very little beyond commodities and perhaps metals, but it's importing vast quantities of stuff that it should be in a position to produce itself, right? So India has kind of ceded that ground. And I think there's a very late realization that you can't have national security and a border dispute with your giant neighbor and at the same time be so reliant on imports. And there's already pressure now building up from Indian business groups that there's got to be a pathway where the national security issues are discussed at a separate level, and it should be business as usual. Right, so perhaps this should provide some kind of an incentive, I think, for India to be, I hate to use the word self-reliant, but in areas like advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, I mean, India is a world beater in the pharma industry, producing vaccines, producing basic drugs. And it's pretty astonishing that you're still relying on imports from China. And this is not a new story by any means. Then if you look at products like cement, if you look at products like, if you're looking at basic chemicals, if you're looking at automobiles, I think India has got probably more resilient industrial capacity to produce stuff for the domestic market. But the wide open question mark is, why can't you use all of that excellence in local manufacturing to be world beating? And, there's a tension here. There's tension here with the Indian government feeling very nervous when Indian companies invest overseas.
Mhm.
There's a sense that you're kind of betraying your country. And, Finance Minister Sitaraman actually chastised Indian business 2 or 3 years ago that they were inadequately investing in India, right? So if you want to be world beating, you're a large Indian business house, you kind of have to step out of your comfort zone. But they feel, there is a barrier in doing that. But at the same time, the absolute proliferation of world beating companies coming out of China, I think there's a sense within the Indian business community that that train has left the station, right? So India has kind of lost that wave that it could have capitalized on, and this predates Make in India. So right now you're stuck with large manufacturers kind of saying, okay, we're going to tap into the domestic market. Then you're going to see these foreign investors come into advanced manufacturing. So there's going to be that sense of grievance. And I don't think, unless there's an emboldened leadership trying to shift dramatically the current policy path, it's very hard to see how India is going to get out of this. I don't want to call this rut, but certainly this challenge situation of not being able to increase manufacturing share of GDP.
So you touched upon local business houses and their grievances and et cetera. So let's talk about them for a second. Have the incentives and the investments brought in through Make in India made India more competitive?
Right. Again, you've got to do this at the product level, right? Is the Apple iPhone price competitive and manufacturing competitive when it comes out of its facilities in southern India? Apple seems to suggest yes, and I think if you're comparing wages with Shenzhen and southern India, there's obviously a huge gap because Chinese wages have really gone up more significantly than India's have. But this is not just a wage competitiveness game. This is a game of being able to upgrade technological skills and be ready. Apple, the iPhone 16 is going to be launched in 2 weeks' time. Can that be produced in India immediately? Answer is probably not. And a lot of other foreign investors, I think, are looking at the Apple experience to figure out if they'll be able to replicate it. And this is happening really because a lot of multinational companies, if you're a European company or an American company, you're hearing from your policymakers probably every single day that you've got to build away from China. You've got to look at other places. You've got to reshore if you can. First of all, why not create jobs at home? If your argument is you're not able to reshore immediately, then try to look for alternative destinations. So India always looms large in these conversations. And so you need a critical mass of investors who are able to make the kind of technological leap and the skills leap that you're talking about, right? So you're saying 14 billion of iPhone products. That number has to be 140 billion in order to say you've created this critical mass of skilled workforce who are fungible, right? Who can literally work not only in India, but anywhere else in the world. And at the same time, kind of marrying the kind of advanced research that the IBMs of the world are carrying out and translating that into manufacturing within India. Because most of that research and development knowledge currently is exported away.
Yeah. And what about, when you have not necessarily the Apples of the world, it's impossible to sort of, create an Indian entity that can be competitive vis-a-vis Apple. But again, in the middle end of the technology spectrum, I'm thinking really on, sort of not the highest end smartphones, but the mid end, like the stuff that, Xiaomi and Oppos are producing, and Indians seem to be very happy buying that made in China phone. In that area, are we beginning to see any sign of local grown technology or local grown companies becoming a bit more competitive and trying to give the imported brands a run for their money?
Right. So let's talk a little bit. I'll come back to mobile phones. If you look at two-wheelers and three-wheelers, India has huge competitive advantage. In fact, India is still the world's largest manufacturer of two-wheelers. And many of those two-wheeler manufacturers are beginning to electrify. And they're creating this uniquely, there's a Hindi word called jugaad, which really is homegrown innovation at a very low price. That probably is the best translation that I can think of.
Good one. Not bad at all.
And so you've got an auto rickshaw plying the streets of Mumbai. Many of them at the moment are on CNG. But I think they see the value in electrifying, and we're not talking Tesla superchargers in terms of how these two-wheelers and three-wheelers go into a charging station. Charging station is probably the local tobacconist, right? It's a local pawn shop, which happens to have an electric charger where the rickshaw guy can charge his vehicle. And so there is innovation taking place, right? So let's not forget that. And in India's startup space, again, is pretty vibrant, but they tend to go into social media, e-commerce
services,
type of solution services, rather than the kind of mobile manufacturing that you're talking about. And I think there's this big question on whether you're able to produce everything at home, or you still need to rely on China or Vietnam, even to produce a low-cost, 500 rupee phone. And I think there's vulnerability there for India. Not everything is available or manufactured in India from scratch. Where I think India can lead is not in trying to compete with Xiaomi or Lenovo or any other Chinese manufacturer, but for domestic entrepreneurs, and again, moving away from the large business houses, to innovate on a smaller scale, to find and again move away from trying to cater to the urban elite, but try to find solutions for your three-wheeler driver, to say that by operating an electric three-wheeler, you're not only benefiting from lower costs, but there's a social value attached to that. And I think you need jugaad to happen on that scale, and you need obviously a widespread success all over the country across a number of sectors, which will really break this logjam where India can really say, and these skills, the two-wheeler, three-wheeler are translatable, where India can really help sub-Saharan Africa, for example,
yes,
which face similar infrastructure challenges. India is probably slightly more advanced. The China offering for many parts of Africa in this field is probably too high-tech and too expensive. And I think Indian innovation can really excel at this level.
Fascinating. I want to talk to you in greater detail about the green transition story in a moment. But Vasuki, in the conversation that we've had so far, you have mentioned Vietnam a bunch of times. So let's do a little compare contrast. I don't think Vietnam had a splashy Make in Vietnam campaign. They probably did it a little more organically, and they probably, sort of got the Chinese to get embedded in a far friendlier manner in their economy, both with FDI as well as tech. But nonetheless, are there lessons for India from Vietnam's experience?
Absolutely, right. So you mentioned China. Actually, the Vietnam manufacturing experience is entirely, it's a, appeal to Samsung to come make in Vietnam. And Korea, I think Samsung was the absolute original big investor in Vietnam. There was a period of time when Samsung had so many engineers working for its facility in Vietnam that a lot of other foreign investors started to complain that there was some kind of hoarding taking place. And I think the Vietnam lesson for India is, and again, many Vietnamese businesses will say they're too small a country, right? They can't be compared possibly with India. But I think Vietnam focused on did not give up the low value addition that easily. And eventually all of that migrated to Cambodia. But at the start of the journey, right, if you really look at the early 1990s, after the Paris Agreement, which essentially normalized Vietnam's integration with the rest of the world, also normalized Cambodia's integration, Vietnam took a calculated bet that manufacturing, they looked at China and said, this is exactly what we want to do, but we are not in China's place at this point in time. So we're going to focus on, first of all, taking away all the shoe manufacturing that existed in Indonesia in the 1980s and 1990s. All of them moved, and many of them were Korean investors. All of them.
So you mean even sneakers, right?
Yeah, sneakers, absolutely.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
All the sneakers that when I lived in Jakarta in the 1990s, they were all produced in Indonesia, and they moved the following decade all to Vietnam, right? So that was so they really learned with textiles, they learned with shoewear, they learned with toys. And then when Samsung made the offer that they were looking, and at that time, Samsung's really wanted to manufacture television sets and other low-end consumer electronics in Vietnam because Korea was getting too expensive. And like Korean chaebols, the LGs and the others followed. And it was that success which laid the foundation for Vietnam to be able to say, now we can embrace mass-scale manufacturing. We can bring in a greater number of multinational companies to come and make in Vietnam. And that, I know Vietnam is going through its own unique structural and political challenges at this point in time. But if you ask any foreign investor today that if you cannot make in China, what would be your logical next destination? Without batting an eyelid, they'll say Vietnam. They'll probably pause for about 10 seconds and mention India.
Yeah, so India is still up there, but not quite there.
Yep.
And you're right that the supply chain with which Vietnam has sort of prospered has a wide range of lessons for any country that wants to embrace manufacturing. The warehouses, the logistics, the port, the tax system. I mean, for a country that is ostensibly a communist country, they're remarkably capitalistic when it comes to accommodating foreign investors.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a story told to me over a decade ago, and this probably is a caricature, right? So your foreign investor lands in Delhi and says, I want to build a 100 million manufacturing facility. And he runs up immediately against the obstacles, saying, you need not only permits and clearances from Delhi, you've got to figure out which state you're going to operate in, you need permits and clearances. And the state and the federal government are not necessarily working in concert. There's no coordination. We try to do the same in Vietnam, and the guy in Hanoi, the state official, has the ability to call up the provincial official and coordinate and make that investment happen at a really, really amazing space, including providing electricity connections. If the road needs to be built, that's the challenge. That's the gap that India needs to overcome. And there isn't, India's uniquely political system and the way the economy is arranged does not allow for that kind of coordination.
Right. Okay, a little bit of crystal ball gazing. We've had a decade of Make in India. It promised a lot. It has delivered somewhat, but nothing compared to what the original promises were. Vasuki, looking forward, both what do you see happening and what should be happening?
Right. So this is India's moment, I think, and has been India's moment for the last 3 decades. I think any policymaker looking back will say, India has done reasonably well. It has accelerated economic growth. It has removed some of the shackles that, led to the infamous Hindu rate of growth since the 1950s. You have a more affluent middle class. You've created an economy which provides opportunity for those who wish to stay back home. And there's certainly, visibly you've got this class of billionaires and millionaires. But I think the big question mark for India is, how do you sustain this India growth story, right? Can you continue to be the fastest growing economy in the G20 for the next 20 years without providing that manufacturing story? And I would argue at some stage, India will come up against the obstacle that, and maybe, hopefully, that stage is today rather than 10 years from now, when it may be too late for India to catch up. There's an absolute sweet geopolitical spot where India can play in at the moment. India obviously is aligned perfectly with the US on security issues, and India is a member of the Quad. It's a member of IPEF, even though it's not part of the trade chapter of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And there's a greater exchange of ideas, greater exchange of policy dialogue that happens in the democratic world, including India today, than at any time in the past, right? So that should provide an enabling environment for foreign investors and local investors to make more in India. Policy obstacles, right? The three barriers which really the government should address in the next year or so. First is the sense it's not a level playing field. The fact that you've got favored groups who seem to be getting all of the benefits in terms of contracts, in terms of being able to produce at scale with very little barriers. And at the same time, you've got a lot of others who feel that they don't, that these favored groups are disproportionately benefit. So India needs to level the playing field, really, to enable other large-scale business houses who have the ability, who have the skills and the knowledge to also invest in this Indian growth story. Second is, and this has been a problem predating Make in India, is lack of predictability on regulatory enforcement, on tax claims. I mean, the GST is and has become a very blunt instrument. I mean, the Indian company Infosys, which, as you know, is an IT services company, was recently placed with a absolute staggering GST claim, which seems to have come out of nowhere. So there's a lack of predictability on regulation, on enforcement, and on taxation that is due from companies, either to state or the center. And that absolutely plays a chilling role, I think, in businesses not being able to plan, and they're absolutely scared that there's going to be a knock on the door, which is going to take away management time and attention. I would say the third problem, and this has got a lot to do with politics, which has kind of been, I think, has been a feature much more dramatic in the last 10 years than in previous governments. There's a real sense of polarization, and I don't mean societal polarization alone. There's political polarization that if you're a non-ruling party government running a state, there is the coordination that was possible in the past with the ruling party in power in New Delhi. That is a challenge. And that absolutely is a problem for investors. Because if you're a foreign investor putting a significant amount of money, you either come through the fast track, right, where everything is made easy for you. It's arguable whether the number of those investors will be 10, 20, 30. It certainly can't be 300, because that will absolutely overwhelm the government's capacity to deliver, right? So you need to create, the fast track should be available for everyone to participate in. And there's got to be that greater level of coordination and sense of national purpose and cohesion. The political environment is charged. It's very difficult, I know. But from a foreign investor perspective, that's an absolute challenge. Yes. And if India is not able to overcome this, you're always going to find successes. I don't mean to say that all foreign investors are going to turn away. I think the sheer size and attractiveness of Indian market will keep India in the in trade for a long period of time. But time is money, and businesses will. I mean, there are other destinations which are knocking on the door, and the businesses will simply turn away.
Right. From Mexico to Hungary, there's quite a few out there asking for the same investment dollar. Vasuki, finally, you talked about the sort of the view from the inside, that's sitting in India, what India needs to do to attract foreign investment. But let's say you encounter a foreign investor tomorrow in Washington, D.C., in New York, who are looking at India as a possible destination for their investment dollars. How would you guide them?
Right. So the two challenges. Two challenges and two questions. I don't think foreign investors need to be persuaded a lot. If you're making breakfast cereals, if you're making consumer products, they don't need a great deal of persuasion that they've got to make in India. And they increasingly feel that in order to make in India successfully and in order to do it quickly, you need to partner with someone locally. That seems to be the model for non-make in India advanced manufacturing kind of, right? So you get a joint venture partner and you outsource the regulatory tax issues to your joint venture partner. You take a smaller stake, and India's now allowing majority stake in many sectors, so they can still retain some level of majority control. That's an easy proposition. And that has happened, I think, since India opened up 30 years ago. But, the central part of our conversation today, that is still not delivering the kind of employment levels and value added compared with the second set of questions that a manufacturer of semiconductors, right? Can I create a fab? Can I build a fab lab in India using NVIDIA GPUs? Can I build a network of data centers because I want to train my large language models in India because of availability of land, availability of technical skills, at least at that high level. That is where the complexity is. That is the problem that Make in India has been attempting to solve in creating this fast track. But the fact that, for me, the worrying thing is the take-up rate. Right? It's one thing to say that you've put $28 billion on the table in PLIs, production-linked incentives, but the take-up rate on the part of foreign investors has been very, very low. Yeah. And 10 years is a long time to say that you've barely touched 2 billion or 3 billion, which happens to be the number, right? So the advice to the foreign investor in the second category is, how compelling is your business model at the moment that you need to move from China, perhaps at a slower trajectory than what one reads in the newspapers, where, the feeling in Washington, D.C. is you simply click off the switch, exit China, and there beckons India and Vietnam. That's not going to happen that way. I think China is going to be a significant manufacturing destination for a long period of time, much longer than what political leaders seem to believe. But if you place India on that slower track, so India is able to sort out its regulatory problems, the coordination problem that I pointed out, but it's more drip that gradually India is going to scale up, then it's probably an attractive destination. But as you well know, foreign investors are impatient. If we were talking, for example, I think 20 years ago, I think 20 years ago, we fixated too much on growth in India, growth at all costs. And I think the conversation is appropriately now turned to, what is the quality of that growth? Yes. What are the growth drivers? Should we be satisfied with consumption and services? And the fact that the greater sense of urgency those questions are being asked within India, I think lends me to believe that there'll be some change. Whether the change is going to be to everyone's satisfaction, of course, remains to be seen. But I think Make in India is an honourable aspiration for the country's policymakers to retain.
Right, Vasuki, I had earlier promised that we were going to talk about the potential of green transition. We're going to leave it for another day. And also, I want to talk about Indonesia with you another day as well. But for today, Vasuki, thanks so much for your time and insights.
Thank you, Taimur. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. And I will continue to be a fan of Kopi Time. May Kopi Time thrive and prosper for the next few decades.
Okay. It is Kopi Time. I'm not a coffee shop, but yes, I will try to keep the lights on in the studio as long as I can. Thank you, Vasuki, and thanks to our listeners and viewers. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge at Sply Studios. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 134 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.